Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another very special Conversations with Authors event for Book Passage. This is a special event within a special series because this is now part of our just second annual Pride programming. We're calling this Pride Programming 2022. And unlike last year, which was a panel, this year we're doing kind of a mini series where we're featuring three authors on 3 different days. So more to enjoy, which actually, since all of them are going to be in conversation with other authors, that actually gives us 6. So even more to enjoy and just be inspired by. In celebration of Pride Month 2022, Book Passage is proud to uplift LGBTQ voices and stories with a special series within the Conversations with Authors programming. This 3-night series will feature emerging authors on the literary landscape, discussing their writings, the importance of queer books, stories, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, and issues within the community. Whether you're part of that community or you're an ally, we appreciate your attendance and your support. If you're live, feel free, live as in joining us live, not in the recordings, feel free to put comments and questions in the chat section on this event. I promise we'll get to them eventually, probably closer towards the end of the event. Also, please remember, if you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It only takes you a second, but it really, really helps us a lot. Kicking off our series is our first featured author, Taylor Brorby, and he's discussing his new memoir, stunning memoir, Boys in Oil, haunting and honest about growing up gay amidst the harshness of rural North Dakota, a place, this is a quote, a place where there is no safety in a ravaged landscape of mining and fracking. Taylor is an essayist, a poet, and environmentalist. As the co-editor of Fracture, his work has appeared in the Huffington Post and more, and including North American Review, and he's actually a contributing editor to North American Review. Joining him in conversation is Taylor's partner, Fenton Johnson, not partner, but his conversation partner, Fenton Johnson, who is the author of At the Center of All Beauty, Solitude, and the Creative Life, a meditation on the solitary artists, writers, and musicians who have inspired him on the importance of solitude in contemporary life. Fenton is also a writing professor at not one but 2 universities, University of Arizona and Spalding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fenton's very capable hands.
Thank you, Paula. And it's great to be back. I know the audience can be from anywhere with Zoom meetings, but for me, it's great to be back at Book Passage, where I've read a couple of times with different books, and also to be back in the Bay Area, albeit virtually. My LGBT activism began in the Bay Area with work against the Briggs Initiative in 1978. And I lived in San Francisco for many years, all through the AIDS years, and the passage of the White Night riots, the gay riots of the early 1990s. So I have a lot of associations with the Bay Area, and it's really great to be back at Book Passage, even virtually. And it's especially great to be talking with Taylor about, as Paula said, a really wonderful memoir. I forget which one of the blurbers it was who said that so it was the New York Times Book Review a critic who said that he wished that a book like this had been around when he was growing up, as is undoubtedly going to come out. Taylor and I share a lot, albeit a couple of decades and more removed from each other, which would be interesting to talk about it. Of course, I'm sure we will. but I also grew up in a very small town in rural Kentucky, in the hills of rural Kentucky. Had a blue collar father, had similar sentiments about the place, similar difficulty with the place as Taylor sets forth in his book, but also a similar passion for and interest in writing about um, the landscape that I grew up in. And there are too many eloquent passages in the book to point to particularly, but certainly for me, the most eloquent passages are the passages, Taylor, in which you write about the prairie, which is a kind of red thread that joins the book throughout, and also functions as a kind of touchstone for your life as you go away from the place, come back to it, go away from it, come back to it, both literally, but also spiritually and emotionally. And not at all unconnected to that is your writing about exile, because for those of us who grew up in places like that, the intensity of the connection is powerful, and yet at the same time, I think there is something, we'll talk about this later in our conversation. There is something about the LGBT experience that makes us outsiders, inevitably and necessarily, to our culture. And an outsider has a perspective by virtue of being from the outside on what it is that is going on. It's the outsider's perspective is, I think, always the most valuable perspective for that reason. James Baldwin comes immediately to mind as a writer who fled to Europe, fled to France, and wrote so eloquently about events in the United States for the remainder of his life. So I'll start with asking some questions, and probably quote some passages in the course of the questions, my questions throughout the book, throughout our conversation. But I thought a good place to begin was, well, let me say, for anyone who is not familiar with the book, it's a memoir of Taylor's, as Paula said, of Taylor's growing up in a very, not just North Dakota, but arguably one of the most remote parts of North Dakota, in an area that was more and more dominated by shallow strip mining and fracking, the two of the most environmentally destructive ways of treating the planet. And Taylor writes very movingly about that elsewhere. There are also passages in the book to that effect. But that one can see, and Taylor makes the linkage very beautifully between the devastation of the environment and the devastation, the emotional devastation that comes with not being able to be, being rejected by the people and the place of one's childhood because of an intrinsic aspect of one's character that is that's fundamental, and having to seek one's destiny elsewhere as a result of that rejection. Along the way, Taylor has been a highly visible environmental activist, including most famously at Standing Rock. Is Standing Rock it's in North Dakota, yes?
It is, that's right. Yeah, the reservation goes both in North Dakota and then in South
and
Dakota.
in South Dakota, yes.
That's
and
right.
being arrested there, but also at various points doing sophisticated studies in spirituality, theology, and also in education. And I thought an interesting place to begin, it's a big question, but to talk about the links between your work in your environmental activism, your forays into studies in theology and spirituality, and your LGBT identity, because for me, I see those as intrinsically connected, and I think you make that connection in the book. So would you take that and run with it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Fenton, and thanks to Book Passage for having both of us here. This is such a great opportunity to talk with you, Fenton, and also be a part of a dynamic three-part conversation this week. Those three things for me, and I'm really glad we're going to make some space to talk about the spirituality aspect in the book. It's not one that I think is being pulled out that much, most likely because the publishing industry sort of pushes against a little bit whenever the C word Christianity comes into play, or religion. But for me, it's not that I grew up in such a churchy family. We went to church on, Christmas and Easter. But when I went to college in particular, I went to a Lutheran affiliated college, St. Olaf College, and you had to take classes in Bible and theology, but it could be the Bible as literature or ethics classes, different ways of understanding theologic perspectives, or Hinduism, so on and so forth. But for me, it really comes out of an intellectual understanding. I mean, being raised Lutheran, I thought it was pretty badass that the founder of the faith nailed theses against took on the largest force on the planet, the Catholic Church at the time. But that came out of an academic understanding as well, and more of an intellectual perspective. And for me, that got shaped through literature in college, and seeing the Bible as a literature, that it didn't have to necessarily become this issue of, do you believe every word as literal truth, but how can that apply an ethical or spiritual framework to your life? I mean, I think of, for me, it's still incredible to read the book of Job. I mean, the questions that God asked Job are all ecological questions that are still confounding. And for me, growing up on the prairie of North Dakota, nothing is talked about more than the weather. Is our hailstones going to destroy the crop this year? Or is a tornado going to rip through town? Or could there be flooding? Or now are they in a perennial drought? Things like this are very much rooted to at least my spiritual understanding of that geography of the prairie. Is one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet. It's literally a great metaphor for diversity. It's a community of intermingled roots that depend on each other. And then to that third part about thinking about being gay or queer in that landscape, I so appreciate what you're saying, Fenton, about you're instantly an outsider. And I think, at least in my understanding of where I came from, and maybe this is true in most of rural America, but I can only really speak to my experience here, there's a sort of fragility around criticism, that to fit in, that we might as well accept the status quo because it's what we've got. And what we've got is pretty limited. Like, you might have a grocery store, you might have a restaurant or two, you might have 2 or 3 different ways of earning a living, because this is what industrial capitalism has brought to us. You can, if you benefited from the Homestead Act, that is the genocide of Native Americans, you have farmland. And so you might be a farmer or a rancher, you might be a coal miner, and then everything else depends on that. If you work at a grocery store, it's because you're living in a company town. And so if you have any sort of criticism of that, it questions basic existence. And I think it pushes people to have to then say, oh my goodness, do I have to try to change something? It's sort of an invitation to activism, that if you encounter a different viewpoint, you might have to admit that there are different ways of operating than what the status quo is. And I have not usually found those voices supported in a status quo community, a community where maybe life isn't easy, yet it's more convenient to fit in and to not question. So if you inherently start questioning things, that shows you how fragile the foundation of that community can be. And yet that's also related to a spiritual understanding of the place, in the sense that animals are dependent on each other, they're dependent on relationships, things must change over time. A community that stays stagnant does not thrive. And so in those ways too, that's my understanding of why, in part, we're seeing such a decline in rural communities, is that maybe we've encountered about a 50 to 70-year stagnation of monocultured industries. And when options are limited, how can you hope people will stay or thrive or develop any meaningful life there?
Yeah. And I would also say that there's been a literal loss of diversity, some of which is statistically demonstrable. Well, the small town that I grew up in, which had about 1,000 people in the mid 19th century, had in the mid 19th century some Jews. There were about 150 Black people. I don't want to get into the discussion of what gay men and what same-sex love looked like in the 19th century, but nonetheless, there were certainly people who were what we would today call queer. And when I was growing up, the 150 Black people had become maybe 20 Black people. The Jews were gone. And today, I would say it is probably true that the queer people all left for the cities because the Black people left for the cities, because for reasons that you point out so eloquently in your book, to live there was constantly to live in fear. And when an alternative became presented, you fled to the cities. The question is, it's an interesting question to pose in the context of your book, and I can't overstate before, I don't want to leave it behind, it's going to be a theme throughout the evening, the way in which you weave together your intimate knowledge of the landscape. We were really outdoors people, but you were even more outdoorsy than I was. You were more butch than I was when you were a kid. And which is pretty butch, and the way you weave that into your experience of alienation and of exile. So it's maybe leaping ahead of where we are, but can you imagine a way in which we heal that wound? Because I'm sure you and I both agree that rural America is essential to the health of America as a whole. And yet when it becomes so dominated by industrial farming and by a monoculture with very little diversity in terms of sexual diversity or racial diversity, it really loses what it needs to thrive. So how do you see a way forward in this?
Yeah, that's a monumental question that needs a lot of thought, in the way of, I'm not sure how we can expect people to be kind to one another when their existence is rooted to destruction, in a certain level of economics. As our shared mutual friend Wendell Berry has taught me, of course, the word for economy comes from the Greek word oikos, and that's care of the household. Well, we know modern industrial economics does anything but that. And it's a half-baked theory, but I have to believe if your economic model is hitched to the destruction of the very place where you live, even if you take pride in putting food on your table, for instance, I mean, as I say in the book, I grew up swimming in a lake that never freezes in North Dakota. Every lake in North Dakota should freeze, but you could sit in it in January with a stocking hat on, and it would be bathtub warm. That, I think, over a lifetime has to psychologically do something to you. All is not well at home. And that, I would imagine, would breed a type of anxiety, a bent towards violence. It's hard to see the place that everyone I grew up around would call God's country. And I thought, it's just so ironic to me that then we're destroying God, if there is a God, God's country, And so there's this sort of oxymoron. One has to trust in that, well, maybe it won't be as bad as I might think it could be on my worst days. And so I'm not yet convinced until other models are put forward and adopted that are rooted, like you're saying, to diversity and preservation and not, as a teacher of mine used to say, so the future needs to run on sunshine and wind, and that we have to live lighter than we've been living in that way, because when you're growing up around people that are literally ripping around the soil, or that the practices of agriculture allow, when the wind whips the topsoil, to blow away, I mean, the clock is ticking. And like you said, I mean, and we know this, I mean, urban areas are dependent on rural areas for so much. And I think about this so much, what you're asking, Fenton, because I would love to have more rural communities that are like Marfa, Texas, where 80 people come to a poetry reading, and they have great public radio, and they have great restaurants, and artists live alongside ranchers, and maybe they don't fully understand each other. And I'm not trying to overly romanticize it to say everything's peachy keen in Marfa, but the idea that, if you and I went to, we could name hundreds of small towns in this country, and if I put my hand on your thigh, if we were out at a bar, I'm not convinced we would be getting out in the same shape we went in. I mean, that's just, I mean, that's explored in my book, but I think, having lived in different parts of the country, but also gone into rural spaces to do my creative work, like the Olympic Peninsula, beautiful rainforest, beautiful national park. It's the logging capital of the world. I mean, it's a huge clear cut, which is what Iowa is a massive clear cut of the prairie. And I think there has to be a restoration of our landscapes, of the land, of acknowledging the history, the genocide that has been wrought, and the destruction of species that we so desperately depend upon for any hope of moving forward. Otherwise, we know what will happen. I mean, I'm sure once coal mining is automated and agriculture is even more automated, people are replaceable in the model of economics we have put forward. And I think when people are replaceable, they become more desperate, and they can become more violent. So it can become even more risky to be different. And you censor yourself when you're in that situation, because at least to stay silent is to hopefully not invite rebuttal in a physical way, or a verbal way at least.
Yeah. Well, you, I've said it, I'll say again that you write so eloquently of exile. I'll extrapolate from what it is that you've just said to say that one of the aspects of the book that I found the most moving was the sense that your personal exile is taking place. Your personal exile comes about as a result of some very specific conditions. You're being an LGBT person in a rural environment, but it's taking place in an environment in which, in a certain manner, we are all in exile, because we are in exile from the planet because we refuse to see ourselves as citizens of the planet and responsible to the planet, instead as something other than a place that we can exploit and destroy. And I see, when I look for some linings of hope, Wendell said to me, I'm not an optimistic person, but I'm a hopeful person.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, if Wendell can say that, I got to find a place where there's some hope. And there are two places that I find hope in your that you write about very eloquently and tell anecdotes about. And one of them is the experience of LGBT people, or of any outsiders, in bringing and pushing that critique to the forefront over and over and over again, because it's in that critique that the beginnings of some kind of change in how we see ourselves ourselves in relation to the planet begin. You write a great deal about that. And then on the personal level, something I thought you might want to say something about. It's such a interesting difference between your parents, who are the younger people and who are so hostile to the notion of, I don't want to speak for you, but it's very apparent in the book. You make it very apparent in the book, so hostile toward having a talented, well-known gay son, and your grandparents, who seem so loving and open, and yet who are a generation before. And I wonder, I saw something in your grandparents over and over again that to me seemed a key to finding the place that rural America needs to go to. Does that make sense to you?
It does. Yeah, I mean, I have one living grandparent right now. Still, my grandpa Brorby will turn 90 in a few weeks here in July. But I had, you know, incredible grandmothers and incredible grandfathers in their own. It's not that they were perfect. I mean, but there's a way that grandparents can seem perfect when you're the grandchild. And I lived a 10-minute bike ride between the two of them. My grandpa Hudson Bueller, who's in the book, is just sort of a larger than life character. I mean, he sunk so many trucks in the Missouri River, which I did not write about because he apparently didn't believe in the parking brake or things like this. But he and I would play Nerf gun wars, where he would just sit in ski goggles and I would set up obstacles. And there was this way that I could be a fuller version of myself rather than my father has a loud voice like I do. And when I was little, I mean, I still weep easily. I weep easily at beautiful things, and I take great pride in being very emotive. It's that, my father could say, "Good morning, Taylor," but it sounded angry, and I would instantly, and it was just sort of this, who is this emotional son of mine? But my grandmother, my grandma Brorby, would paint my fingernails and gift me aprons because I loved twirling in them. And my grandpas were so creative in their own way. My grandpa Brorby is a skilled woodworker. I've written all my books at a desk he made for me when I was 8. He would be in the local town musical. My grandpa Hudson Bueller would make his own choke cherry wine. We would go out berry picking together. And both were they were great raconteurs, so social. And my grandmas, I think, were a little more introverted, and yet they allowed their husbands to be who they were too, and were social in their own ways. And I think there was a real rootedness in both sides here to generosity, which I could never tell, though I now know. My grandpa Brorby was a coal miner, and my grandpa Hudson Bueller was a poor farmer. I had no real clue growing up who had more money, because my poor poor farming grandfather, just, there was always food. Everything was like an open table. There were lots of hugs, and there was this great spirit of generosity at a time that I really feel in America, even myself personally, sort of closing off from other people, not letting people in. But I think we're in such a psychic state of fear, and in certain ways that's understandable. My grandparents seem to model this very openness. I mean, my grandpa Hudson Bueller, the first thing you had to do and the last thing you did would hug him. You would kick open the door and his hands would be wide, which is a very vulnerable gesture for a man. And so I was modeled, and that was modeled for me, and I was taught that. And it seemed that whatever I was interested in, they made space for. There wasn't really a critique. So in that way, they allowed me to be me, which is about the greatest gift you can give anyone. And especially when you're growing up in a place where you sort of sense there's danger. If people know too much, like I knew somehow I couldn't be outside in one of my like gingham aprons that my grandma Brorby made for me, because there's one picture when I'm about 3 or 2 out trimming the hedges with my father with a Fisker's scissors. And that's the last picture of me outside in an apron, that something must have been said. And So there are ways that grandparents or mine made space, I think, in ways, and probably because of growing up in the generation they did in the Depression, of having different priorities than my parents maybe did in sort of their outlook of the world.
Yeah. Well, there was also the arrival of mass media, the
Right.
arrival of television, the arrival of the big world, which brought good things, but also brought the abandonment of a lot of traditional ways of doing things. I don't know. I mean, I'll ask you this question because it was the fond hope of my generation that I mean, I think I can say that I'm probably the last generation of of queer people who could grow up, could get to literally 18 years old and believe that there was no other person in the world like me. That there was, because there was no evidence of anybody else. I had never seen, there were no images on television. I knew nothing about books. I knew nothing about the rich LGBT history of LGBT literature. And it was our fond hope that breaking out of the closet, which, which I seize every occasion to say that the foundation on which that breaking out was based
Yeah.
was a lot of men and women who died of AIDS and who are not with us now. And all of our visibility, in a way, it was happening anyway. Stonewall predates that. But the 80s were really the years where our backs were literally pressed against the wall, and men and women working together and across racial boundaries achieved a kind of visibility for queerness that it came at enormous cost, but it's the foundation on which we build our lives. But it was our hope that this wouldn't happen again. And yet, in a way, what I've seen happen is that, for me, as long as I kept my head very low and was butch as possible, and it was a very conscious decision on my part in my teens, my job is to hang on until I get out of here. My job is to escape. And yet I could lie low because no one knew about
Right.
queer
Right.
people.
Right.
Nobody, I mean, guys used words like fag or whatever, but they really didn't know what they meant.
Yeah.
Today, that's not possible
Right.
because of media, and in a way that I never thought about, but I've seen happen.
Yeah.
It's put young queer people in a certain way in more danger because they're now the obvious target of violent actions.
Right.
And I don't know if that, I mean, I felt that in a way in reading your book, that the difference between my youth was that invisibility was the place that I retreated to, and it was a terrible place to be, but at least it was an option.
That
Whereas
seemed possible.
for you, the guys, immediately, they go to you and they say, you're the fag, you're the queer in our midst.
Mhm.
And they've learned about that. What does that mean for, the LGBT people? And I'll seize the opportunity
Yeah.
to say what a gift this book is to young LGBT people everywhere, but especially people who are growing up in that environment and will find themselves in it. But what is that? How do we create a future for them that is not either the choice of invisibility or
Yeah.
violence?
Yeah. I got an email out of the blue the other week. I mean, as you know, when you write a book, you get questions, you get emails from people you've never met and things you've never thought about. A gay man had emailed me. He's opening a nursery and a florist shop in more of a rural part of the country, and he wants to be himself and have a pride garden and talk about diversity. But also, of course, and it's the real concern, not to bring any negative sort of reaction to who he is to light. And I think that is so prominent right now with social media. I mean, I think about how I'm going to sound like such a Luddite and crank here, but how early children get smartphones. And when a child gets a smartphone, you are literally giving them the world, no matter what. And children are themselves in their full gloriousness, and that is someone, just because a boy likes dance doesn't mean that he's queer on any level, but we make these assumptions. And I think with so easily putting ourselves online and being addicted to that dopamine experience, so much can happen that also gives opportunities to others to harm people. And so I think there is real risk there, and there are things we need to be talking about, especially, I mean, the Trevor Project just last month told us all that suicide ideation amongst LGBTQ youth is up again. It's 45%. That means for all of us who are listening, if you know 2 queer kids, one of them basically thought last year that it was a viable option to end their life. That's a horrific state to be living in. And so I think there's a way where we have to force the conversation about who are your trusted people, who can you be talking to no matter what, to know that that live communication is always open. But I also find, having been someone who's contemplated suicide and had suicidal ideation, others need to reach out. I mean, I think that's this book is an attempt to reach out and to say, you're not alone, even in the digital age. I think there's something different between seeing an Instagram post and at least reading a shared narrative to understand a life rather than a moment in a curated life, and part of, I think that is part of our work as queer adults, is to give shape to a story, that maybe, we do have to say it gets better on one hand to keep someone going, and then to keep shaping a conversation as a young queer person ages of how do you keep going? How do you keep making it better? I don't want to be Pollyanna or rosy. My life is infinitely better at this point at 34 than it was at 14. 20 years ago in 8th grade was hell. I didn't want to go on. And so, I wouldn't have read fucking Moby Dick had I done what I wanted to do, and had my mind blown, and I wouldn't have seen beautiful things around the world. And so there are things like that I think it now falls on someone like me to be out there and to be present in those ways, to say, we're here for you. And actually, we're going to be active for you. Because I think it's one thing to say you're an ally, you're open, you're someone they can confide in. I think it's really up to us who are in more positions of security and stability to be engaged and to kind of get messy in a younger person's life in a good way, to let them know that you're there and keeping an eye on them. And that's part of what I think about, because I've benefited from that from others. That I think it's insanely hard, Fenton, to your question right now, to it's hard to be invisible, which is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
It's I would never want to be invisible again, but I say that sort of romantically, of knowing when I'm in rural America, I dress very differently than I do when I'm on a college campus, and I hold myself differently than maybe how I do in the rest of my life, So
Yeah.
even as an adult, there are ways that I try to be invisible again out of sheer safety.
Yeah. Yeah. The drag queens are the bravest among us.
Oh, totally.
Not any accident that they were the ones who acted out at Stonewall.
Yeah.
We have a couple of great questions from Anita. I want to read them one at a time. The first one is to the aspect to the writing of memoir, a question that often comes up for people who want to write their own stories and yet who feel hesitation about doing it. Anita asks, were you ever hesitant to write the memoir because of making yourself even more vulnerable to your family or people in your community knowing your sexuality?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and one I think we all have to think about, especially with memoir, about when you set something down in print, you're committing to something, and at least a certain version of reality, pardon me, as you understand it. I think I've chosen in this book to really keep it focused on me as much as possible, which some people might say is a little more selfish, but to Anita's question, um, let's just say my treatment of people in the book is very kind and I think very generous, and that's intentional. It's not making things up or saying, oh, this is the better version of how things really happened. I mean, there's the night I was outed and the night after are very, very hard scenes to write and to bring up, not only for me to think about, but then to try to write them well so someone else feels it. But there are things that are not in the book that I would not put in print because I wasn't interested in putting out a memoir that was a tell all, burn it all down. That's not the mission I'm on. My mission is much more to say, why is it that we have a huge blank slate of a literary landscape for queer memoir in this huge swath of America? What does that do to a person? So I think part of that is choosing to keep it hyper focused on me as a way of moving through that landscape and meeting people. But though my family is in this book, and families involved, I chose the memories that were wonderful about, coming out to my nephews and how they reacted, or coming out to my sister, and that I wanted to show that that was possible. And that I didn't have to put in print something that could maybe come across as petty. I think part of it, to Anita's question, is this is a book where I'm trying to show a life rather than get revenge on anyone. And I want readers to be open and to come to their own conclusions about what the character Taylor Brorby has experienced in his life and the relationships, but I wasn't trying to get a final say. So I think, to be blunt, there was worry. It's why I took a more generous, kind tone, because I at least want to keep options open, and choosing a very different tone can make things seem very final. And I just wanted to be kind and respectful in how I was writing this book. So that was an option I chose. People can choose a different, people can write a tell-all memoir, and that's perfectly great and fine. I love those too. I just tried to strike a bit of a wider tone than that, I think.
I think there's also, I published a memoir called Geography of the Heart that was about the death of my partner, who was the only child of Holocaust survivors of AIDS in Paris in 1990. And that was a time when tensions were really the highest. It didn't seem like there was any cure, any treatment, much less a cure for AIDS, HIV disease, anytime in the future. Everyone, there had been lots of activism in the 80s, but everybody was burned out or dying or dead. That was really, really a terrible moment. And in writing that book, and Ronald Reagan and his minions work, and the many of the leaders of the Roman Church were the most visible presence in terms of talking about AIDS on the national scene. And in writing that book, I kept wanting to. I mean, every 10th paragraph, I would get up on a high horse and lecture the reader about Ronald Reagan's sins. And I just knew I couldn't do that. And the reason I couldn't do that is a reason that you were just speaking to. In the end, one has to trust the power of the story.
Right.
The story itself is sufficiently powerful, and the more powerful the story, the less elaboration or decoration it needs. And I finally typed out a note and taped it to the top of the shelf above my desk, something I never do, but it was the best piece of advice I ever gave myself, which was just tell the damn story.
Right. Right.
And it's really about, one can have those moments of editorial commentary, but as Gertrude Stein said, 39 particulars for every generality.
Yeah.
She didn't mean that literally, but she meant you need the 30, you tell enough of the story and you earn the right for some
Right.
editorial observation. And that's really essential. But nonetheless, the story is what has to take, and I felt that happening in your book.
Yeah, thank you, Fenton. I mean, I think too, I mean, part of to Anita's question is I'd recommend, writing a memoir when you no longer live where you're writing about. I mean, that's another perk. I mean, to be blunt to Anita, I earn my keep by being a college professor, and there's no creative writing program in North Dakota. So even if I wanted to live there, it would be a sort of hard scrabble life. But that does make it easier. I mean, I'm seeing people in this tiny town I grew up in and elsewhere who are buying the book and reading it. And I'm sure there's the day coming where maybe I'll get some negative emails from people, but I've been shocked by people who've read it and who have said they've read it in one sitting. I mean, these are people I grew up around who are sending, posting this online. And so there's at least that. I mean, at least a few people are taking the time to read it and contemplate it. It's kind of nice to write a book when you're not living in Dodge, when you've gotten out of Dodge. Is not that there's anything salacious in my book and those sorts of ways, but it would change how I would, to live in the place, in a small place that you write about. That's a risky endeavor for sure.
Anita had another question, which I think is really interesting, which is, it's not an either or question, but have you experienced in rural areas more hostility or pushback for being an environmental activist or being an LGBT activist?
I know, pick your poison, I mean, I don't keep a running list, to be honest, about this. I will say, when I've given lectures in more rural places around environmental issues, I usually will identify more as a conservationist, because that implies hunting, usually, ducks unlimited or pheasants forever. I guess for me, in both of these issues, I'm looking to give people information, which I think the more information you have, then you usually make a more informed decision. And hopefully that more is, aligned with, oh, gay people aren't evil, and also, like, maybe taking care of the planet is a good thing, I mean, if you sort of show the narrative of what fracking does to rural America, how can you not be persuaded that it's maybe not a great practice? I would say, depending on where you are. So if I'm in the Bakken oil boom, I'm not going to claim to be an environmentalist. I probably won't come out as gay, though I think there's a lot more gay sex happening in that man camp stuff than we're hearing about. So anyone out there, write that novel about that. I will certainly buy it and blurb it for you. So, but I think both are risky, Anita, and I don't mean to presume, but I think that's part of what's behind that question, is both have their own risks. I would always say it's riskier to be queer, because at least people can say we live in a beautiful place and we should protect it.
Yeah, well, they're somewhat famous to me at any rate, but I have sort of famously explicit rural sex scenes in a couple of my books.
Yeah.
I can quote Wendell on this. Wendell did not like my last novel, and he was very forthright about that. I sent it to him in Galley, and he sent me a letter in which he made very clear that he didn't like it. But he said, "You write really well about sex," and I thought, I wonder if I can like excerpt that, like Walt Whitman did with the letter from Emerson, and say, Wendell Berry.
Yeah, that would sell a few more thousand copies, Ben. Yeah, because it would shock us all. Be like, just the idea of Wendell Berry even contemplating sex is
Well,
mind-boggling.
I wouldn't say that about Wendell, but I know Wendell.
I
No, Wendell's an old friend, and Wendell has been very baudy, not only in person but in his writing.
Yeah.
So anyway, Paula, now there's a Stephen Petro, an old friend of mine, and a more recent friend of yours,
Right.
asks how writing Boys in Oil and talking about it has changed you.
I think in some ways, now having conversations like this or interviews, especially, you live in your mind so much as you're working on a project and you're just trying to get the damn thing down as best you can. And now it's almost coming up for air and going, what did I do? I mean, that was so long ago when I finished this book, or it feels like it, even though it's now just coming out. I think it's had, like, for me, even your question, Fenton, how we opened it, I probably would have never thought before to think explicitly how is spirituality, queerness, and environmentalism sort of related in my understanding. And it's like you say, of course they're related. They're in my book. I'm one person. They come out of me, and but that's how, to Stephen's question, I've sort of been changed, is I've had to rethink what I'm even up to. I'm not one of these writers that over analyzes his own process or thinking, or tries to get like a literary theory down in there. I'm just trying to tell a story, but now I'm having to go back and almost self-analyze what I did, or what I think I did, or hopefully didn't do. And so it's changed me by making me more ponderous about my process as a writer, and then how I even try to share that with other people in conversation.
I would say, as I say, I lived in the Bay Area for many years, and I was back there, probably a semester or sometimes longer, when I was teaching, was living in Tucson and teaching at the University of Arizona. I was up in San Francisco all the time, and it is the beloved Bay Area. It gave me myself. I cannot imagine being who I am without having. The San Francisco gave me the gift of coming out. I constantly remind people that in the early 1980s and the late 1970s, there was really only one city in the world, and I'm including New York and Los Angeles, and certainly Washington, the most closeted place in the world I know because I worked there, where one could have what we would call a professional career as an openly gay person, and that was San Francisco. And it's why I went back there. And it is near and dear to my heart. At the same time, that I get impatient with people who I see fundamentally the way forward in our environmental to our environmental challenges, that effectively in the foundation, it is a spiritual challenge, because what we have going on is a deep illness of the spirit that is fundamental to our abuse of the environment. And it doesn't have to be, not at all, any particular spiritual approach. I'm completely open to all of them. But I think the problem is fundamentally technology is wonderful and can help and is necessary. But finally, we have to change how we see ourselves in relation to the planet, how we live on the planet. And those are fundamentally what I would call spiritual considerations. And so that was what I found so exciting about reading your book, is that all of those elements were there. And in fact, at least for me, I could see in those forays into graduate school in theology that those were a way that you were, both your budding environmental activism and your budding concerns with spirituality were trying to find a place where they were talking to each other. Does that make sense? And I see those coming out in this book.
Yeah, I think it's so rooted to, at least those questions for me are always, where do people get their sense of ethics? And for a majority of people on the planet, it comes out of some type of spiritual tradition. It doesn't have to. but that's what's been so curious to me about, how did laws come into being? Where does our ethics about how we approach land use and things like that? And those are fundamentally spiritual questions, as you're suggesting, Fenton. Yeah.
Yeah. Paula asks if you would be open to living in a rural area again. I laugh because, in fact, I just moved. I'm in the process of moving to the Hudson Valley because of wanting to live in a more rural area where I don't live in fear. Taylor, you, on the other hand, I mean, I would say you don't live in rural areas, but you certainly live in small. Spartanburg is not a
Yeah.
small city.
Yeah.
And you were living in a part of the world where on one hand it's really wonderful because you have a kind of tightness of a bond among queer people, because queer people still know that we have to circle the wagons and protect each other, that there's not room for there to be a break in the circle of the wagons because we live in a dangerous world. And on the other hand, it's a dangerous world. And I love being in the South because of that closeness and intensity of affection and support among the queer community. And at the same time, I feel like I have to watch my back as I walk down the street.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you feel that way from your time in South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, what's been so odd about this time is I've been, a hermit these past 2.5 years of sort of being a high risk person, being a type 1 diabetic. For a lot of my time has been over Zoom and FaceTime with old friends and stuff, though I have a favorite baseball hat that's just black and white lettering. It says "gay and tired," but I've never worn it in public in Spartanburg, which maybe gives you your answer, Fenton. So I mean, to Paula's question, it would be a very particular community that it would have to. I mean, the blunt answer is I can't imagine that yet. I mean, I'm giving some readings in more ruralish places. And let me say, I'm doing a lot of deep breathing exercises. I mean, I'm no martyr. I don't want to put myself at risk. I also think there's some responsibility to be out there if I can, and if I can tolerate it, to be in a place talking about these issues. But yeah, I don't feel fully comfortable. And that's probably part of the perk of writing a book, at least from we're not getting a coastal perspective on what the middle of the country is. I mean, I grew up in the middle of the continent trying to articulate what this can be like. And it's similar to how you described going to the South, Fenton, of sort of, I mean, I deeply miss the prairie. I mean, I love everything west of the Missouri River in particular in this country. It would have to be, I mean, if people consider Lawrence, Kansas rural, which to my mind it's not, Lawrence is a very progressive town in Kansas. I could see there, but if we're talking back to a town of 600, no, no is the answer, Paula. No, yeah. Just to
Well, let me ask you if there's something that I've enjoyed this conversation tremendously. I will say that there are some smaller communities where that is where it is becoming more and more possible to live as an openly queer person in areas that are far removed from the coasts. I think that is, I'd like to think of those places as sort of beacons, and that gradually there will be, the world works in mysterious ways. Influence works in mysterious ways. The ultimate lesson always to bear in mind, of course, is the Buddhist lesson of chop wood, carry water, that you invest yourself in activism without being attached to the outcome, which may happen in our lives, but probably will not. I hold forth the example of Frederick Douglass, who the great African American writer and activist, who saw the passage of the 15th Amendment and must have thought that liberation has come, and then lived to see the implementation of Jim Crow, and arguably at the time of his death you could say that for Black people in the South, in some cases, it was worse than it was at the time of slavery, because lynching was in full swing. The Reconstruction had ended. The states were given carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to do, and they did. And yet that doesn't diminish for a moment his activism. And so from my point, I want to seize that as an opportunity to say, I see your book as another, what can I say, another one of those beacons that is out there. Is there something you want to say by way of conclusion that we haven't touched upon, or that you particularly want to call our attention to?
Well, thank you for that, Fenton, and those observations too. And I mean, just this is not in this book, but it just happened. I mean, Bismarck, the town where I graduated from high school, that felt like I had gone to a cosmopolitan place from my town of 600 to a town of 65,000. Just had their Pride Festival organized by a high school classmate of mine, Jonathan Frey, who is just doing the Lord's work in Bismarck around this. And it was well attended, and people were there having a great time. And that, I don't even know what that would have been like in high school. Would have I gone? I'm not even sure, but that did not exist. And so there are, like you're saying, I think in those ways, when those cracks come, that's the time to really put some more weight behind it, to really create an opening. And so I'm sure people who are tuning in are seeing that in unexpected ways too. And we do need to remind ourselves that those things are happening and making what was invisible now more visible. And so I just really appreciate the opportunity, Fenton, to be in conversation with you, someone whose writing I have long admired and looked up to, and this has been a pleasure. And Paula, thank you for bringing us together for this event. This has been a lovely evening for me.
Yeah, thank you, both of you, Fenton and Taylor. What a, I don't know, such an interesting, enlightening, but I think very important conversation, and not one that we often have, even with, Book Passage, and we do hundreds of events, but I felt like this was very particular, and mostly because your book is just, as described, as haunting, raw, but written, I mean, very literary. Like, I mean, it's like you said, it's not a tell-all, but yet you do pick up on your vulnerability, and it's a story that needed to be told. Thank you for being the one to do it. I see that as being brave on many levels. And thank you for shepherding such a wonderful conversation, Fenton. We appreciate it. Thanks to our audience for joining and engaging. We do have plenty of copies of Taylor's book at both our locations, San Francisco and Corte Madera. You can come in safely in person, or you can go online and order, or you can give us a call. And I think Taylor is going to be sending us book plates if you haven't already. So you can have a signed edition. But definitely support our authors, support these events by actually buying the books. You will not regret it. It's a wonderful book. Please join us tomorrow on Thursday at the same time, 5:30 Pacific time, for our next one. Tomorrow is with YA award-winning author Julian Winters. So it should be another fabulous conversation. Thank you, and until tomorrow this time, good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you, Fenton.
you.